The night Brandon Cole called his pregnant wife a burden was the night he unknowingly gave another man the chance to become a father. The ballroom of the Manhattan Grand Regency shimmered beneath towering crystal chandeliers, their golden light reflecting off polished marble floors and rows of champagne glasses balanced on silver trays. The Tech Titans Gala was the kind of event where billion-dollar deals were whispered between sips of sparkling wine and reputations rose or collapsed in the space of a single conversation. At the center of it all stood Brandon Cole, the celebrated CEO of Cole Dynamics, a man whose face had appeared on the cover of business magazines across the country. His dark tuxedo fit him perfectly, tailored in a way that made him look every inch the confident empire builder investors adored. Beside him stood Vanessa Blake, a striking model whose bright smile and effortless elegance had quickly made her the newest fascination of New York's elite social scene. Cameras flashed as reporters leaned closer, hoping to catch a clever quote or a glimpse of the couple everyone had been talking about for weeks. Brandon lifted his glass with a relaxed grin, answering questions with the polished ease of a man who had spent years mastering the spotlight. When one reporter asked about rumors of his past marriage, he laughed softly, the sound casual and dismissive. "That was a long time ago," he said. "Just a mistake from another chapter of my life." The surrounding guests chuckled politely, the comment disappearing into the low hum of conversation that filled the ballroom like a distant tide. But in a quiet corner near the tall windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline, someone heard every word. Emily Whitmore stood perfectly still, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her expression calm enough that no one passing by would have guessed the history that connected her to the man across the room. The city lights outside shimmered through the glass behind her, reflecting faintly across the deep sapphire fabric of her evening dress. 7 years had changed her in ways the gossip columns had never bothered to notice. The timid woman Brandon once dismissed had long since disappeared, replaced by someone steadier, someone quieter, someone who had learned that dignity did not require noise. Around her, the gala carried on with effortless glamour. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne, laughter drifted across the room, and conversations about venture capital and global expansion rose and fell like waves. Yet beneath the surface of that polished celebration, something was about to shift. Because the moment Brandon Cole declared his past a mistake was the exact moment the grand ballroom doors slowly opened. Conversations faltered, heads turned, and into the golden light of the gala stepped a man whose presence alone could silence a room. Daniel Whitmore, rival billionaire, investor, and the last person Brandon Cole expected to see tonight. Daniel Whitmore did not rush when he entered the ballroom. He walked with the unhurried confidence of a man who never needed to prove that he belonged in any room he stepped into. Conversations softened as guests recognized him. Investors turned their heads. Board members whispered quietly to one another. Daniel Whitmore was not simply another technology billionaire. He was the man whose companies had quietly outperformed Cole Dynamics for the last 5 years, the strategist whose calm decisions had built an empire that investors trusted even more than Brandon Cole's explosive ambition. His charcoal suit was understated but flawless, the kind of tailoring that suggested power without needing attention. The golden light from the chandeliers brushed across his silver cufflinks as he paused near the entrance, scanning the room with steady eyes. Brandon noticed him immediately. Of course he did. Rivals always recognized each other. Brandon's relaxed smile stiffened for half a second before returning to the polished expression he had perfected for investors and cameras. Vanessa leaned closer to him, whispering something with a playful laugh, unaware that the atmosphere in the room had quietly shifted. Daniel greeted a few familiar faces along the way, exchanging firm handshakes and calm words with board members and venture partners. Yet his gaze drifted across the ballroom until it settled on the woman standing near the windows. Emily Whitmore had been watching the moment unfold with quiet composure. When Daniel's eyes met hers, something subtle changed in his expression. It was not surprise. It was recognition, a calm warmth that existed beneath the surface of his otherwise disciplined demeanor. 7 years earlier their meeting had been far less glamorous than this night. Emily had been standing in a small charity office in Boston, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Outside the windows, early winter rain had tapped softly against the glass, while volunteers sorted donation boxes across the room. She had been 6 months pregnant then, exhausted from sleepless nights and uncertain days. The life she once knew in Manhattan had vanished almost overnight, replaced by a quiet apartment and the slow realization that survival sometimes meant beginning again from nothing. Daniel had arrived that afternoon as a donor visiting the charity foundation his company supported. He had expected a routine meeting and a brief speech before returning to the airport. Instead, he noticed the young woman carefully organizing supply lists with steady focus, while 2 small knitted baby blankets rested folded beside her bag. Something about the determination in her posture had caught his attention. She had looked tired, but not defeated. When they spoke for the first time, Emily did not mention Brandon Cole or the headlines that had once surrounded her marriage. She simply spoke about the volunteer program and the families it helped. Daniel remembered the quiet strength in her voice. It was the kind of strength that did not ask for sympathy. Over time, their paths crossed again through charity events and foundation work. Emily gave birth to twin boys months later, Lucas and Noah, and Daniel visited the hospital with a simple bouquet of white lilies and a card that read only one sentence: "If you ever need help, you are not alone." The years that followed had slowly reshaped all 3 of their lives. And now, standing inside the most powerful room in Manhattan's technology world, Daniel Whitmore took one final step forward toward the center of the gala, while Emily watched calmly from the edge of the room, knowing that Brandon Cole still had no idea what part of his past had just walked through those doors. Daniel Whitmore stopped near the center of the ballroom, greeting the event host with a calm handshake, while the quiet ripple of attention spread through the crowd like a shifting current. Investors who had been speaking moments earlier now watched carefully, aware that whenever Daniel Whitmore appeared at an event like this, something significant usually followed. Brandon Cole set his champagne glass down on a nearby table, his expression composed but alert as he studied his rival from across the room. The 2 men had competed for years, their companies chasing the same contracts, the same investors, the same headlines. Brandon had always believed he understood Daniel Whitmore. Quiet, strategic, predictable. But something about tonight felt different. Daniel spoke briefly with the event organizer before stepping onto the small stage at the front of the ballroom where the evening announcements were scheduled to take place. The soft hum of conversation faded as the microphone adjusted with a small click. The golden light of the chandeliers framed him as he looked out across the audience, his voice steady and clear. He thanked the organizers for hosting the annual gala and spoke about innovation, investment, and the future of technology in America. His tone was calm but confident, the voice of a leader whose companies shaped entire markets. Brandon folded his arms slightly, listening with polite patience, waiting for the speech to end so the evening could return to its usual networking rhythm. But Daniel Whitmore was not finished. After a brief pause, he glanced toward the far side of the ballroom. Emily felt the shift before anyone else noticed it. She had been standing near the tall windows overlooking the dark Hudson River, watching quietly as Daniel spoke. When his eyes met hers across the room, a gentle smile touched his face. Then he said her name. "Emily, would you join me up here for a moment?" A soft murmur passed through the crowd. Guests turned their heads, curious to see who Daniel Whitmore had just invited onto the stage. Emily stepped forward calmly, her sapphire dress catching the warm light as she walked across the polished marble floor. Every step was steady, measured, unhurried. Brandon watched her approach with a growing sense of confusion. At first he did not recognize her. 7 years could change a person in ways photographs never captured. But as she moved closer to the stage, something familiar surfaced in his memory. The shape of her eyes, the quiet composure in her expression, the unmistakable presence of someone he once believed he had erased from his life. Emily stepped beside Daniel Whitmore beneath the lights. The room had grown so quiet that the soft clink of a champagne glass somewhere near the back echoed through the ballroom. Daniel rested a gentle hand at the center of Emily's back before looking toward the entrance again. "There are 2 more people I would like you all to meet tonight," he said warmly. The ballroom doors opened. Once more, 2 young boys walked in together, each holding the hand of an older woman who guided them toward the stage. They were identical in every way, their dark hair neatly combed, their small black suits carefully pressed. Lucas and Noah Whitmore. They climbed the short steps beside Emily and Daniel with the relaxed confidence of children who had done this before at charity events and school ceremonies. The crowd smiled softly at the sight of them. Brandon did not smile. He stared, because the moment the boys stepped into the light, he saw something in their faces that turned the air cold in his chest. The same dark eyes he saw every morning in his own reflection. The same unmistakable features. Yet when the boys reached Daniel's side, they looked up at him with easy affection, and one of them spoke first. "Dad, is it time for the speech now?" And in that quiet sentence, Brandon Cole understood that the life he once discarded had continued without him in ways he had never imagined. For a moment the ballroom felt suspended in silence, as if the air itself had paused to absorb what had just happened. The words of the small boy still lingered in the room like a quiet echo. "Dad." Brandon Cole stood frozen beside the table where he had set down his champagne glass minutes earlier, his mind racing to reconcile the impossible picture unfolding before him. Across the stage, Daniel Whitmore rested a reassuring hand on Lucas's shoulder while Noah stood close beside Emily, the two boys perfectly at ease in the glow of the chandeliers. Guests began whispering to one another in low voices, the soft murmur spreading through the ballroom as realization slowly rippled across the crowd. Some of the older investors exchanged curious looks. Others simply watched Brandon, sensing that this moment carried a history far deeper than any business rivalry. Emily knelt slightly to straighten Noah's jacket collar, her movements gentle and calm. There was no anger in her expression, no bitterness, only the quiet composure of someone who had already lived through the hardest chapters of the story long before tonight. 7 years earlier she had stood alone in a small Boston hospital room, holding 2 newborn boys, while winter snow drifted past the window. Lucas had cried loudly the moment he arrived, determined and strong from the first breath, while Noah had been quieter, his tiny hand gripping Emily's finger as if he understood that his mother needed courage as much as comfort. The nurses had moved softly around the room while Emily whispered their names for the first time, promising them a future she had not yet figured out how to build. Daniel Whitmore had visited that evening carrying the same quiet steadiness he carried into every room. He had stood beside the hospital bed with a warm smile, speaking gently to the twins as though they already understood him. He had not asked questions about the past or offered sympathy that might reopen wounds. Instead, he had said something simple that Emily would never forget. Families are not defined by the mistakes that created them. They are defined by the people who choose to stay. In the years that followed, Daniel kept that promise in ways that did not need announcements or headlines. He attended school recitals and science fairs. He taught Lucas how to ride a bicycle along a quiet Boston Park path one bright Saturday morning, while Noah clapped excitedly from the grass. He helped with math homework at the kitchen table, while Emily prepared dinner nearby, the warm scent of tomato soup filling their small home. Slowly, quietly, their lives grew into something steady and whole. Back in the Manhattan ballroom, Daniel looked down at the boys with a proud smile before addressing the audience again. "Lucas and Noah are the reason I believe the future is always worth investing in," he said calmly. The crowd responded with polite laughter and scattered applause, charmed by the confidence of the 2 young boys standing beside him. But Brandon heard none of it. He remained rooted in place, staring at the stage as the realization continued settling into his chest like a weight he could not move. Across the room, Emily finally lifted her gaze and met his eyes for the first time that night. She did not look angry. She did not look triumphant. She simply looked peaceful. And somehow that quiet peace unsettled Brandon far more than any accusation ever could. The applause faded slowly, leaving behind the gentle hum of conversation that always returned after a moment of surprise. Yet something in the atmosphere of the ballroom had changed in a way that could not be undone. Brandon Cole finally picked up the champagne glass he had abandoned earlier, but he did not drink from it. His attention remained locked on the stage where Emily stood beside Daniel Whitmore and the 2 boys who had unknowingly turned the entire evening upside down. Lucas had already begun whispering something excitedly to Daniel, pointing at the enormous chandelier above them, as if the entire gala felt like an adventure rather than a room filled with the most powerful people in American technology. Noah stood close to Emily's side, his small hand resting naturally in hers, comfortable and secure in the quiet warmth she offered. The sight unsettled Brandon more than he expected, because the calm confidence in those children was not the kind that came from money or status. It came from stability, from years of knowing someone would always be there. Across the ballroom, Daniel finished his brief remarks and thanked the audience once again. His voice carried the same steady authority that had built companies worth billions of dollars. Yet there was a softness in the way he looked toward the boys that no business headline had ever captured. Emily gently guided Lucas and Noah down the short steps from the stage while Daniel spoke with the event organizers. Guests nearby smiled warmly at the children as they passed, some quietly complimenting their manners, others simply charmed by their confidence. Brandon watched every step they took. Memories he had buried long ago began pressing forward in his mind with uncomfortable clarity. He remembered the day Emily had told him she was pregnant. The way she had stood in the kitchen of their Manhattan penthouse holding a small envelope from the doctor's office, her expression hopeful and nervous all at once. Brandon had been distracted that morning, focused on a major investment meeting scheduled later that day. He had listened only halfway as she spoke about the future and the family she imagined they would build together. At the time he had believed success demanded sacrifices. What he had not realized was that some sacrifices could never be reversed. The sound of laughter nearby pulled him back to the present. Lucas had discovered a small tray of chocolate desserts on a passing waiter's cart and looked up at Emily with hopeful curiosity. She smiled and nodded once, allowing the boys to choose one each. Daniel rejoined them a moment later, placing a gentle hand on Noah's shoulder while the child carefully balanced the small dessert plate. The gesture was so natural that no one watching would question the relationship between them. Brandon felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest as he realized the truth he had avoided for 7 years. The boys did not need him. Their lives had grown strong roots in a different direction. And the man who had quietly stepped into that role had done it without ever asking for recognition. Across the room, Emily sensed Brandon's gaze again and met it calmly for a brief moment. There was no anger in her eyes. Only the quiet certainty of someone who had already moved far beyond the place where his choices once held power over her life. In that silent exchange, Brandon understood something that no investor report or market forecast had ever prepared him for. Success could build companies and fortunes, but it could not reclaim the years he had willingly walked away from. The gala slowly returned to its rhythm, yet for Brandon Cole the evening had begun to feel strangely distant, as though the conversations, music, and soft laughter around him were happening behind glass. Investors continued discussing market forecasts near the bar, and the orchestra resumed its quiet instrumental melody near the far wall. But Brandon's attention remained fixed on the small family moving comfortably through the crowd across the ballroom. Lucas and Noah had finished their desserts and were now standing beside Daniel Whitmore while he spoke with several board members from a major venture capital firm. The boys listened politely, occasionally glancing around the enormous room with the curious fascination of children experiencing something grand but unfamiliar. Daniel bent slightly at one point to answer Lucas's question about the enormous skyline visible through the windows, pointing toward the glowing towers of Midtown Manhattan beyond the river. The simple exchange looked effortless, natural. Brandon realized that the boy had asked the question without hesitation, without uncertainty, the way children spoke to someone they trusted completely. Emily stood nearby speaking quietly with one of the charity organizers who had helped coordinate the gala. The warm light from the chandeliers reflected gently across her sapphire dress, and Brandon noticed something he had never truly seen when they were married. She looked lighter now, not in appearance, but in presence. The quiet tension that had once lived behind. Her smile had vanished. Years ago, Emily had often waited for Brandon to return home late from meetings, rehearsing conversations in her mind about family dinners or future plans that never quite seemed to fit into his schedule. Tonight, she moved through the room with calm confidence, speaking easily with guests who respected her for reasons far removed from the man she had once been married to. Brandon felt an unfamiliar unease stir in his thoughts. Vanessa Blake touched his arm lightly, bringing him back to the present moment. She had been speaking about an upcoming fashion event in Los Angeles, her voice cheerful and animated, but when she noticed his distant expression she paused. "Brandon, are you listening?" He forced a small smile and nodded, though his eyes drifted once more toward the other side of the ballroom. Across the room, Daniel had just finished his conversation with the investors and was guiding Lucas and Noah toward a quieter corner near the tall windows where the view of the Hudson River shimmered beneath the city lights. Emily joined them a moment later, placing a gentle hand on Noah's shoulder while Lucas excitedly described something he had seen earlier near the stage. The four of them formed a small circle, their conversation relaxed and unhurried, as if the hundreds of powerful guests around them did not exist. Watching them stirred another memory Brandon had not expected to revisit. A rainy afternoon years ago when Emily had once suggested they take a weekend trip out of the city, somewhere quiet where they could slow down for a few days. Brandon had dismissed the idea without thinking, explaining that the company needed his attention more than a vacation. At the time, it had felt like a responsible decision. Now he wondered if that moment had been one of many small crossroads where life might have unfolded differently. The realization settled over him with uncomfortable clarity. For 7 years he had believed the past was finished, that moving forward meant never looking back. But across the ballroom stood living proof that the future he once ignored had continued to grow without him, shaping itself into something strong and steady in the hands of another man. The night outside Manhattan had deepened into a velvet stretch of dark blue sky, and the lights of the city shimmered across the Hudson River like scattered gold. Inside the ballroom, the music softened into a slower melody as guests began drifting into smaller conversations, the formal speeches now finished. Yet Brandon Cole remained near the same table, his attention pulled again and again toward the quiet corner where Emily, Daniel, and the boys stood together near the windows. Lucas had discovered the telescopic viewer installed beside the glass, a decorative piece meant for guests to admire the skyline. He stood on the small step beneath it, peering through the lens while Daniel adjusted the angle slightly so the boy could see the illuminated spire of the Empire State Building in the distance. Noah stood beside Emily, asking questions in a thoughtful voice about the bridges stretching across the river. Emily answered patiently, her tone warm and steady, explaining how each bridge connected different parts of the city. Watching them, Brandon felt the strange weight of time pressing against his memory. He realized he had never heard his own children ask those kinds of questions before, because he had never been there to listen. A group of executives passed behind him discussing a new acquisition deal, their voices confident and energetic. Normally Brandon would have joined the conversation immediately, his instincts always tuned toward opportunity and influence. Tonight he barely noticed them. Instead, he remembered another evening many years ago when Emily had sat beside him at their dining table, explaining that she had read an article about childhood development and how important it was for fathers to spend time with their children early in life. Brandon had smiled politely, then returned to the financial projections open on his laptop. At the time it had seemed like a small moment. Now it felt like a door quietly closing behind him. Across the room Lucas suddenly laughed, his voice bright and clear as Daniel pointed out a ferry gliding slowly along the river. Noah leaned closer to see it too, their excitement simple and genuine. Daniel listened to them both with easy patience, occasionally asking a question or offering an explanation that kept their curiosity alive. Emily watched the exchange with a soft expression that carried the quiet pride of someone who had seen this scene play out countless times before. Brandon realized something in that moment that unsettled him deeply. Daniel Whitmore had not merely appeared in their lives as a wealthy benefactor. He had built a place inside their world through years of ordinary moments. School mornings, weekend walks, bedtime stories, the invisible threads that form a family. Brandon had once believed success was measured by the scale of his company, the headlines celebrating his achievements, the growing list of investors eager to partner with him. Yet standing in the middle of the most powerful technology gathering in the country, surrounded by influence and wealth, he could not ignore the quiet truth unfolding across the ballroom. The life he once dismissed as an inconvenience had grown into something meaningful without him. Emily turned slightly, as if sensing his gaze again. For a brief second their eyes met across the room. There was no accusation in her expression, no demand for acknowledgement. Only the calm distance of someone who had already built a new future and no longer needed to revisit the past that had once defined her. The music shifted into a slower jazz rhythm, and the glow of the chandeliers softened as the evening moved deeper into its second half. Most guests had returned to their conversations about investments, mergers, and the next wave of technology startups that would shape the coming decade. Yet in one corner of the ballroom, time seemed to move at a different pace. Lucas had stepped away from the viewing lens and was now pointing toward the far end of the skyline, where a cluster of lights blinked steadily above the river. Daniel listened carefully as the boy described what he thought might be a helicopter landing pad. Instead of correcting him immediately, Daniel asked what made him think that, encouraging the boy to explain his reasoning. Noah leaned against the window beside Emily, watching the reflection of boats moving across the dark water below. Emily placed a gentle arm around his shoulders, her presence calm and steady as she listened to the conversation unfolding between Daniel and Lucas. The scene carried the quiet rhythm of a family that had learned how to exist together through years of ordinary evenings and shared routines. Across the ballroom, Brandon noticed something he had never expected to feel in a room full of powerful executives and billion-dollar deals. He felt like an outsider, not because anyone had pushed him away, but because the life unfolding in front of him no longer had space for the version of himself that had once stood at the center of it. Vanessa was speaking again beside him, describing a magazine feature she had recently been invited to photograph in Malibu. Her voice was bright and confident, and several nearby guests nodded politely while she explained the concept for the shoot. Brandon tried to listen, but his attention drifted back across the room. The contrast between the two worlds inside the ballroom felt impossible to ignore. On one side stood ambition, cameras, reputation, and carefully managed appearances. On the other stood something quieter, but far more grounded. A father answering a child's question about city lights. A mother watching her sons explore the world with curiosity. The simple stability of a home that had been built slowly over time rather than assembled for public display. Brandon felt the memory surface before he could stop it. A night long ago when Emily had waited for him in their apartment with dinner prepared, the table set carefully with candles and 2 plates. She had told him she wanted to talk about their future, about how life might change once the baby arrived. Brandon had barely stayed long enough to eat before leaving again for a late meeting with investors. At the time, he believed the conversation could wait. There would always be another night. Standing in the ballroom now, he realized how many nights had passed without him noticing. Lucas suddenly turned from the window and said something that made Daniel laugh softly. The boy then tugged lightly on Daniel's sleeve and pointed toward the orchestra near the far wall. Daniel nodded and bent slightly to answer him, the two of them speaking quietly while Noah joined the conversation. Emily watched the exchange with an expression that carried quiet gratitude, the kind that grows only after someone has spent years proving their place in a child's life. Brandon slowly set his untouched glass back on the table beside him. For the first time that evening, he understood something he had never considered before. Success could buy influence, admiration, and headlines, but it could not rebuild the quiet moments that had already passed into someone else's hands. The orchestra shifted again, this time into a softer piano melody that drifted through the ballroom like a quiet tide. The gala had reached the stage of the evening when conversations grew more relaxed, and the sharp edge of business talk softened into personal stories and quiet laughter. Yet Brandon Cole remained strangely disconnected from the atmosphere around him. Guests moved past his table carrying glasses of champagne and plates of delicate desserts, but his attention continued drifting back toward the window where the 4 figures stood together beneath the city lights. Lucas had now convinced Daniel to walk with him toward the orchestra. The boy's curiosity had moved from the skyline to the instruments themselves, and he watched with fascination as the musicians adjusted their music stands between songs. Daniel spoke with one of the violinists for a moment, explaining quietly to Lucas how long it took to learn an instrument well enough to perform in front of hundreds of people. Noah followed a few steps behind them, holding Emily's hand while he listened carefully. Emily smiled as Noah asked whether children could learn violin too. Daniel turned toward him and said that of course they could, explaining that patience and practice mattered more than talent in the beginning. The small conversation unfolded naturally, without hurry or performance, the kind of quiet teaching moment that children remember years later without realizing how important it was at the time. Brandon watched the scene unfold and felt the weight of another memory rise from somewhere he had tried to keep closed. He remembered the day Emily had first suggested they sign up for a parenting class before the baby arrived. She had shown him the website on her tablet while they sat on opposite ends of their living room couch. Brandon had skimmed the page briefly and said he was too busy preparing for a product launch scheduled that same month. Emily had nodded politely, then closed the tablet, telling him it was probably not that important anyway. Brandon had believed her. Now he understood that it had mattered far more than either of them had admitted. Across the ballroom, Lucas laughed again as one of the musicians let him pluck a single note on a violin string. The clear sound rang softly through the air before the musician smiled and carefully took the instrument back. Daniel placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder while explaining how delicate the instrument was, his tone patient but warm. Emily watched the exchange quietly, the faint reflection of city lights shining in her eyes. She did not interrupt the moment. She simply stood there, present in the way that steady parents learn to be after years of watching their children discover the world. Brandon felt something settle into place inside his thoughts as he observed them. The realization did not arrive with drama or sudden shock. It arrived quietly, like the slow understanding that comes when a long equation finally resolves itself. Daniel Whitmore had not taken something from him. The truth was simpler and far more difficult to accept. Daniel had stepped forward and built the life Brandon had chosen to step away from. And now, watching Lucas and Noah laugh beside the orchestra while Emily stood nearby with calm pride, Brandon realized that the family he once dismissed as an inconvenience had grown into something real and lasting without him. The violin's final note faded gently into the warm air of the ballroom, and a ripple of applause followed as the orchestra prepared for their next piece. Lucas clapped enthusiastically, his small hands moving quickly while Noah joined him with a quieter but equally sincere smile. Daniel leaned slightly toward them, saying something that made both boys nod with excitement before guiding them back toward the tall windows where the city lights stretched endlessly into the distance. Emily walked beside them, her steps calm and unhurried, the quiet rhythm of someone who no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone in the room. Across the ballroom, Brandon Cole watched them return to the corner where the night skyline framed their silhouettes. The four figures stood close together now, Lucas pointing again toward a ferry gliding slowly across the dark water, while Noah asked another thoughtful question about how ships navigated the river at night. Daniel answered patiently, explaining how the lights along the shoreline helped guide the boats safely through the channel. The boys listened carefully, their curiosity growing with every explanation. Brandon realized something subtle but undeniable in the way Daniel spoke to them. He never rushed their questions. He never dismissed their curiosity. He treated each question as if it mattered. Brandon remembered another night long ago when Emily had once asked him whether he thought their child might enjoy astronomy one day. She had been reading about children who loved watching the stars. Brandon had answered without looking up from his phone, saying that they could figure that out later. Later had never come. Vanessa's voice returned beside him once more, soft, but slightly uncertain this time. She asked if everything was all right, because he seemed distracted all evening. Brandon nodded automatically, offering a small reassuring smile that did not quite reach his eyes. His attention drifted back across the room again. Emily had just laughed quietly at something Lucas said, her expression warm in the golden light of the chandeliers. Daniel reached down and ruffled the boy's hair in a familiar gesture before turning toward Noah to answer another question. The simple ease between them carried the kind of history that could not be created overnight. It had been built slowly, day by day, through years of presence and patience. Brandon felt a quiet realization settle into his thoughts with a clarity he could not ignore. For years he had believed that the choices he made were temporary sacrifices, necessary steps toward building a powerful future. He had assumed that life's personal chapters could be paused and resumed whenever he found the time. But standing in the middle of the ballroom, watching the family he once walked away from share a moment beneath the city lights, he understood the truth that no business victory could rewrite. Time had continued moving forward while he focused on everything else. And in that time someone else had stepped into the empty space he left behind and filled it with something steady and real. Lucas suddenly waved excitedly toward the river as another boat passed beneath the glowing bridge lights. Daniel and Emily leaned closer to see what he was pointing at, their heads almost touching as they looked out across the water. Noah stood between them, perfectly at ease in the small circle of warmth they had created together. Brandon slowly looked down at the untouched glass of champagne in his hand. For the first time since arriving at the gala, he realized that the quiet truth unfolding across the ballroom had nothing to do with rivalry, success, or reputation. It had everything to do with the life he once believed he had plenty of time to live. The orchestra began another gentle piece, the piano notes drifting through the ballroom like soft rain. Conversations continued across the room, yet Brandon Cole barely heard them anymore. His world had narrowed to the quiet scene unfolding near the tall windows where the Hudson River shimmered beneath the city lights. Lucas had discovered a small booklet on a nearby display table that explained the history of New York's bridges. He opened it with curiosity, showing the page to Daniel, while pointing excitedly at a photograph of the Brooklyn Bridge taken decades ago. Daniel bent slightly beside him, reading the caption aloud in a patient voice, explaining how engineers had once built structures like that without the modern technology people relied on today. Noah listened closely, occasionally asking thoughtful questions that Daniel answered with calm attention. Emily stood beside them, watching the conversation with a soft expression that carried years of quiet gratitude. Brandon felt another memory rise slowly to the surface of his thoughts. There had once been a night when Emily had tried to show him a children's book she had bought during her pregnancy. It explained how babies slowly learned about the world through questions and curiosity. Brandon had glanced at the cover briefly before telling her he had a call with investors that could not wait. Emily had simply nodded and placed the book back on the shelf. At the time, he had believed there would always be another chance to read it later. Watching Lucas and Noah now, Brandon realized those moments had not waited for him. They had unfolded anyway, just with someone else standing there. Across the ballroom, Daniel closed the booklet and handed it back to Lucas, then gestured toward the skyline again as another ferry glided slowly beneath the glowing suspension cables of the bridge. The boys leaned closer to the window, fascinated by the moving lights on the dark water below. Emily stepped beside Daniel, their shoulders nearly touching as they both watched the children quietly. There was no performance in the moment, no effort to impress anyone nearby. It was simply the calm presence of two adults sharing responsibility for the lives growing beside them. Brandon noticed something else then. Emily's laughter had changed. Years ago, when she attended events like this beside him, her smile had often carried a hint of tension, as though she were careful not to say the wrong thing or draw the wrong kind of attention. Tonight her laughter sounded lighter, freer, the kind that comes when someone finally lives in a life that feels truly their own. Vanessa said something beside him again, but Brandon barely registered the words. Instead, he continued watching the family across the room. Lucas suddenly said something that made Noah laugh, and Daniel shook his head with playful patience before guiding them back toward the center of the ballroom, where several guests had begun gathering for the final toast of the evening. Emily followed beside them, her hand resting gently on Noah's shoulder. Brandon felt a quiet truth settle deeper in his thoughts. For years he had believed that the most powerful moments in life were the ones celebrated under bright lights, the ones that appeared in headlines and investor reports. But standing in the glow of the chandeliers, watching the children walk confidently beside the man they called father, he realized that the moments shaping their lives had happened far away from cameras and applause. And those moments had built something that success alone could never replace. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as the final portion of the evening began. A quiet signal from the orchestra announced the traditional closing toast of the Tech Titans Gala, and guests gradually gathered closer to the center of the room. Crystal glasses were lifted from silver trays, and a soft anticipation settled over the crowd. Brandon Cole moved with the others almost automatically, though his attention remained fixed on the small family approaching from the other side of the ballroom. Lucas and Noah walked confidently beside Daniel Whitmore now, each boy holding a sparkling cider glass that a smiling waiter had offered them for the toast. Emily followed beside them, her calm presence grounding the moment in a way that made the grand ballroom feel unexpectedly intimate. The host stepped onto the stage and began thanking the attendees for supporting innovation and philanthropy throughout the year. His speech was polished and sincere, but Brandon barely heard the words. Instead, he noticed the quiet details unfolding in front of him. Daniel leaned slightly toward Lucas, reminding him gently to hold the glass with both hands so it would not slip. Noah looked up at Emily with a small question, and she answered softly before brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. The gestures were simple, almost invisible within the larger event, yet they carried the quiet weight of years spent caring for the same two children. Brandon felt the realization settle deeper than before. The life standing across the room from him had not been built through dramatic gestures or sudden turning points. It had been built through thousands of small moments exactly like these. School mornings, questions about city lights, hands held while crossing busy streets, the invisible threads that turn time into family. The host lifted his glass higher as the room grew silent. He spoke about the power of vision and the importance of shaping a better future for the next generation. Around the ballroom, hundreds of glasses rose together, catching the warm light of the chandeliers like a constellation of tiny stars. Daniel raised his own glass calmly, Lucas and Noah imitating the gesture beside him with proud concentration. Emily looked toward the stage with a soft smile, her eyes reflecting the golden light around them. Brandon lifted his glass as well, though the movement felt heavier than he expected. Across the room, Lucas glanced up at Daniel and whispered something that made the man smile quietly before nodding in agreement. Noah followed the motion of the crowd, carefully raising his glass a little higher as if he were part of something important. In that moment, Brandon realized something that had taken the entire evening to become clear. The boys did not look toward him with curiosity or recognition. They did not search the room for the man who had once been part of their story. Their world was already complete. The toast ended with a soft wave of applause, and the orchestra began the final melody of the night. Guests resumed their conversations, while waiters cleared empty glasses from the tables. Brandon lowered his own glass slowly, his eyes drifting once more toward the quiet family standing beneath the tall windows. Emily had turned slightly toward Daniel as Lucas and Noah excitedly described something they had seen during the toast. Daniel listened with patient attention, his expression calm and warm in the golden light. And in that simple moment, Brandon understood the quiet truth that the entire evening had revealed. The future he once believed he controlled had already moved forward without him. The final notes of the orchestra drifted softly across the ballroom as the evening slowly began to wind down. Guests gathered their coats, exchanged final handshakes, and promised future meetings that would shape the next year of innovation. The golden glow of the chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors, while the city skyline shimmered through the tall windows like a quiet reminder that New York never truly slept. Brandon Cole remained standing near the same table where he had spent most of the evening, his thoughts heavier now than when the night had begun. Across the room, Emily, Daniel, Lucas, and Noah prepared to leave with the same calm rhythm that had followed them throughout the night. Lucas was still talking excitedly about the violin he had seen earlier, while Noah asked whether the ferry boats continued running through the night. Daniel answered both questions patiently as they walked toward the exit, occasionally glancing down to make sure the boys stayed close in the crowd. Emily walked beside them with quiet confidence, her expression peaceful in a way Brandon had never truly understood when they were married. For a moment she paused near the coat check and Lucas tugged gently on her sleeve, pointing toward the skyline visible through the glass doors. Daniel leaned down to listen to what the boy was saying, then nodded with a small smile before guiding both children toward the exit. The moment was simple, almost ordinary, yet Brandon realized it carried the quiet strength of something that had taken years to build. He remembered a night long ago when Emily had once stood beside the window of their old apartment watching the city lights, telling him she believed families were built from small moments that people often overlooked. At the time, Brandon had been answering emails on his phone and had barely listened to her explanation. Tonight, those words returned to him with a clarity he could not ignore. Across the room, Emily briefly glanced back before stepping through the open doors with Daniel and the boys. Their silhouettes passed beneath the soft lights of the hotel lobby and slowly disappeared into the quiet movement of the city outside. Brandon remained where he stood, watching the empty doorway for a long moment after they had gone. Vanessa spoke beside him again, asking if they should leave as well, but Brandon did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked out through the tall windows toward the endless lights of Manhattan. For years he had believed that success meant moving forward without hesitation, leaving behind anything that slowed him down. But standing in the quiet after the gala, he finally understood something the night had revealed piece by piece. The most important parts of life were rarely the moments celebrated under bright lights or announced in front of crowds. They were the quiet choices people made every day about who they stood beside when the room grew silent. Somewhere outside in the city, Daniel Whitmore was helping two boys into the back seat of a car, while Emily stood beside them with the calm certainty of someone who had already found the life she once hoped for. And inside the ballroom, Brandon Cole realized that the future he once believed he controlled had quietly chosen a different path long before he ever noticed.